Hey, it's finally here. You're listening to episode 100 of the D6 podcast.
I don't know anything more important in our society or in the kingdom of God than to help the church, help the family.
Discipleship is not an event, it's a way of life.
And one day it just hit me that discipleship at home was not about doing more. It was about inviting Christ into what we were already doing.
The goal of family ministry is not families sitting on the couch holding hands and singing Kumbaya. The ultimate goal is families that love God, love people, and make disciples of all peoples.
So that's why you're here. You're here to say 1 hour a week, as significant and as awesome as it is, we know that it's not enough and we want to be intentional with every hour.
You're listening to the D6 podcast. Here's your hosts, Ron Hunter and Jeremy Lee.
You're listening to the family ministry podcast that helps you connect the church and home. And it's celebration time, Ron.
It is celebration time. We're looking forward to this episode.
No, we've been looking
We have been teasing this forever.
And it's a little awkward because we're actually sitting at a table with people watching us do this now. And because we have invited world-renowned guests because it's our 100th episode.
I know, and our audience doesn't really realize this, but there are multiple microphones in this room, our producer, and a lot more text than we're accustomed to having because of this episode.
Not only is it our 100th podcast episode, we have done I've not been here the whole time, you guys have done 10 years of the D6 conference, and this is just something worthy of celebrating. Now, we could have invited anybody. We've had well over 100 guests on our podcast, and even more than that have been at the conferences. And you actually chose 4.
We did.
We invited Lydia Randall, one of the great friends of the conference, but she got sick and couldn't make the
last
plane.
minute, yes.
So
and she hates not being here.
We had to call in the subs. I'm just teasing. But you've invited. There are 3 voices at the table today that have been one of the foundational voices of the D6 movement. So can you kind of just explain why the heck they're here?
Absolutely. These gentlemen were here because if we go back to the very beginning, it really predates the 10 years of the conference. I had the unique honor and privilege of pastoring for 11 years before coming to Randall House. And it was during that period of time that I felt pretty much the same way I think most pastors and youth or student pastors feel today. We were losing some of our young people, and this was before all the books were being written about losing our young people. There wasn't a lot of literature on Deuteronomy 6 or anything. I mean, this goes back, we're talking 20 years, 25 years. And certainly the Pentateuch was not a cool book, a set of books. And I felt that awkwardness of I was losing and didn't know what to do. And we began to focus on those issues and see what we could do to make a difference with that. And I realized that value of aligning. I had some people speaking into my life about that alignment. And so when Randall House hired me as the replacement for the retiring executive director, we decided we would dismantle Sunday school as we've known it. Because in essence, people would study a lesson and then it'd be repeated by the teacher. And then a set of parents would go home and all their kids would have studied a different lesson. And there could be no real connection as they bumped into the pain points of life. And so we took that down and we launched a family-aligned curriculum. That was kind of the beginning of this discussion. And then several years later, our marketing director walked in my office. He says, Ron, what would it look like if we had a family event? And we just invited people in and had a conversation around Deuteronomy 6 like we've been trying to teach and train all these teachers. I said, let's sit down, and we pulled out a legal pad and we began to plan this thing out, and we said, okay, we could do this and we could bring people together. What are some of the biggest names in family ministry that we can think of? And we started listing them. And we put George Barnett at the top of that list because he wrote that book, Raising Up Spiritual Champions. We put Dr. Trent's name. You were on that list, on that original piece of paper. And we continue to make this list of 6 or 8 names. We had the head of Focus on the Family, the head of Family Life, and we looked at each other and says, okay, who should we invite? Singular. And I don't remember who said what, but we kind of looked at each other and said, let's invite them all. And I went to our board of directors and I said, we would like to host this conference. It's going to cost about $400,000. We don't have it in the budget, but I think we can carefully navigate this and plan this. But I think this could be something significant for the kingdom, and it's the right thing to do because we're losing our culture. And so in 2009, all of you guys were on that year. You were major voices. Not only were you speaking to the audiences, you've been our advisors along the way, along with several others. There's been a whole host of people that have been, I think, stewarding and shepherding this movement. It's not been a single person or a single organization. And so that's why these individuals are here, because they have been with us from the beginning.
Well, let's meet them then.
Yeah.
I'm dying with anticipation, even though I know who they are. We spent some time together yesterday in preparation for this and went home and told my wife. So I'm going to introduce you the way I explained it to my wife, because I think I am an example of so many people, so many ministers especially. I told my wife, I said, I just had a moment yesterday when I was looking at y'all and going, I could speak individually of the impact you've made on my journey and my life and what God's done through me. Every one of you had significant influence on that, and I know I'm not the only one. We've got Dr. John Trent on faculty at Moody Bible, and written, I think we tallied up 26 books. I love to say that because I think it's amazing. One of those books, though, especially The Blessing, sold over 2 million copies, but the copy that landed in my lap changed my life. I thank you for that. I'm so honored that you are with us today. Thank you for being with us. Then we have Dr. Brian Haynes, who is the pastor of League City Church. What's the name of your church?
It's Bay Area Church.
That's it. In League City, though.
In League City. You're right.
And he's senior pastor, author of significant books in the family ministry movement, a huge voice there. And your milestones strategy, we've talked about this, huge influence on me, but so many others. Then we have Dr. Richard Ross, professor of youth ministry at Southwestern Seminary, again, author of a whole bunch of books, amazing voice, but thank you as well, because I've spoken this to you before. You've had such significant influence on my understanding of what it means to connect to and parents and to understand the kind of spiritual influence they have in the lives of kids. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. Let's just take a break and hear a quick word about the D6 conference, which this panel, by the way, helped launch 10 years ago.
Scripture and modern-day research attests to this truth. When one generation commits to and engages in the discipleship of another generation, people of all ages know Jesus and become more like him. This commitment requires us to say goodbye to the myopic focus on the next generation and instead broaden our view to every generation. Every generation. Moms, dads, grandmas and grandpas, aunts and uncles, kindergartners and middle school students, college freshmen and newlyweds, each one awakened to Jesus Christ and living out a vibrant faith with one another. We invite you to adopt this focus at the D6 Conference, a family ministry event built on the Deuteronomy 6 philosophy of generational discipleship. You will experience 3 days of strategy, resources, and action steps to help move your church forward together. Discover what's in store at d6conference.com.
So thank you guys all for being here. It's such an honor that you'd get on a plane, fly out here, and spend some time with us. So let's just begin. Dr. Trent, I want to begin with you. When we began the D6 movement, I keep saying we like I was there, but when they began the D6 movement, I'm in the family. But Dr. Trent, you were working with a coalition at the time, and you were studying the effects of the influence of parents on kids and faith development.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you get a call from these people, and they ask you to be a part of D6. Kind of talk to us about that work of that coalition and how it kind of came together with D6.
Well, actually, Ron, I think you actually came to one of the Innovation Alliance meetings, and what it was I have a great friend, and D6 has a great friend in Kurt Bruner, who really ended up being a champion for Home Point, which is in tons of churches, another model, like Brian's and other models that are out there that really unpack faith at home. But back in the day, Kurt was working and focusing on the family, and had been there. He was the senior vice president of everything. He's creative, he's a great guy, but he really wanted to after impacting literally thousands of people through his ministry at Focus on the Family, he wanted to go work at the local church and say, hey, it's the same thing, Ron, that you said. We're losing the next generation. How can that change? And we were riding around on a golf cart. We're both terrible golfers. And he told me, hey, I'm leaving Focus, but would you help me do something? And so we got these 12 churches together that were all over the map. 3 of the biggest churches in the country, 3 small churches, 3 in the middle. But we were looking for early adapters to come up with, well, what's what's the problem, first of all? Do you remember this, Brian? You were there. And then also, what's here's the problem. Well, what's the language? How do we start, using the kind of language makes a difference on, well, how do we frame this? But then we challenged everybody to go back. Now, this is from Saddleback to, I can't remember the church in Michigan, but it was like, a church of 200 to we had 3 of the largest churches in the country. But they were to go back and do something to do this, to impact faith. How do you and out of that came a whole bunch of models. And out of that, this guy and Matt Morkins showed up and as a guest, I think in California. Is that right? Was it in California?
Probably so.
Yeah, and because we hosted it. But we never meant, it was really to just fan the flame. Kurt and I weren't looking to say, well, let's do like a D6 conference. We just were praying that out of this would come something that was more not just sustainable, but would just explode things. And that's where you guys showed up. So that's kind of how that all happened. And then, that's how they showed up. And then they asked us to go speak at the first D6 conference. And I was honored to do that.
Absolutely. Dr. Ross, while you were speaking on the main stage in year 1, God had blessed because, number 1, year 1 was 2009. We launched, all of you helping in this process, helping us promote it, get the word out there. And in the fall of 2008, the recession had hit. And literally the economy just kind of, the bottom dropped out. And this is how we know it was a God thing. God really blessed and way more people showed up than we ever anticipated. It was an overwhelming success and God gets credit for it. So large crowd in that room. You were standing on the main stage and you were emotional. I remember this moment and I've heard it at least 1,000 times because we've replayed it on so many clips, so many promotional areas. You gave this line from the main stage.
Some of us, even in this room, have been trying to wake up the American church to the home for about 30 years, and the American church has always rolled over and said, don't bother me. I want to say to those guys and to everyone else that cares about this issue, you being in this room these days is the church waking up. It has finally happened by God's grace, and we are about to take off on the journey of our lives. I'm telling you we are. I can't talk about that any longer or I'm going to tear up. This is a significant moment in the history of the church.
Tell us how the church has awakened, and then go a little further and tell our listeners how it's still asleep.
One of the most wonderful things that I think has happened over this 10-year period is the pastors, the leaders of the church, mostly would say, it is part of my calling, it is part of my ministry to come alongside mom and dad, to be supportive to the home, to see the home become spiritually alive. They do now believe that's part of their calling. I think it would be a very small number who would say, I'm not interested in that, I have no intention of touching that. I think the vast majority have got the message, this is central to the ministry of the church. Now, that does not mean that in every case folk are doing things week in, week out that actually influence mom and dad and support the family. But it's on their radar. My group would be the student pastors, and I think they're one example. I think most student pastors have moved from, I would prefer parents not coming around what I do. I think they've moved from that to, yeah, somehow, some way, I know I'm supposed to be doing this. I don't see this as a negative. I see it as a great opportunity for the future. But the possibility now is to take people that kind of have their heads wrapped around the subject and show them, practically speaking, what do you do that actually is transformational, what makes a difference in people's lives. So I think the fields are white in terms of possibilities, but at least most of the leaders of the church know we've got to move in this direction.
Well, I want to hear from you guys the same way, and we'll start with you, Brian. How have you, in your experience with D6, seen it affect church culture specifically?
Yeah, I think over the last 10 years, D6 has probably had a more monumental impact than they even imagine. I've had the opportunity to travel around and talk to people and listen to what they're doing. You can hear D6 echoes from all over the place. People associate discipleship and the Shema, which is Deuteronomy 6, which was not the case 10 years ago. In my opinion, everybody started with Matthew 28, 18 to 20. But now you have, in theology and practice, many churches think, okay, this is Deuteronomy 6 plus Matthew 28, 18 and 20. So I think there's been a significant impact when it comes to how the church is thinking theologically, but also in practice. And what I believe is there's a higher percentage now in churches who have associated with D6 in any way, whether it's to come to the conference or whether it's to interact online or take part in the D6 days from home or whatever. They are now seeing the percentage of parents in their church that actually do something to make disciples expand. And I remember 10 years ago when I'd go around, I'd find somewhere between like 7 and 10% of parents with kids 18 and under did anything besides just bringing their kid to church to really disciple them. And I see that percentage changing. And so I think it's like eating an elephant. It's one bite at a time. It's slow, but it's worth it. And what D6 has done has been a catalyst for all of that.
The very first D6 conference, one of the things that you all have always done, which I think has been just phenomenal, is I'm a churchman. I've been an elder in our church. It's an honor to go on the elder board. It's an honor to go off, when your term's over. And I've been a pastor, but I also have a parachurch ministry. But it's the church that really needs to wake up. And what was so exciting was to see these workshops. So there was the main platform, and that was just phenomenal. But then you could go to these workshops and break out and actually sit next to these guys and ask them questions afterwards in the discussion. And that's what I thought was so viral and just such a great opportunity for people to really get the idea that, well, you know what, I can bring my whole team. And now I think the next frontier, we're going to get into the future, is it started, I think, very much with, wouldn't you say, it was really the children's pastor that was showing up, then the youth pastor that really got integrated at the D6. I think the next thing, we're going to see grandparenting ministry, show up, where all of a sudden people are beginning to realize all up and down, it's not just, this isn't just a children's ministry conference. It is. It certainly focuses on let's change the life of a kid. But it's really exciting to see it start to filter, break down those silos all through the church.
Dr. Trent, you mentioned the future. Let's turn our attention there if we could for a minute. And I'll toss this to start with Brian, if you don't mind. What would you say is the future of family ministry? How do you think the church will grow and develop in the way that they reach families in this culture in the future?
I think my assessment of the present is that everybody's trying to do something in regard to family ministry. And in many cases, it's becoming sort of an appendage or a silo of next-gen ministry, like children's ministry or youth ministry. But I believe that the future is actually seeing family ministry as part of a larger discipleship scenario. I think we're all called, especially as a senior pastor, I look at the congregation and I see all kinds of people. You've got the stereotypical married couple with 2 kids and a dog, and they're definitely there. But then you've got singles with kids, singles with no kids, grandparents, all these people, and they all need to be discipled. I really believe that the church is going to take a step now toward understanding that family ministry has a lot to do with adult discipleship, because if you can't make disciples of adults, there's no way they're going to pour into the next generation of children and teenagers that are coming up. I actually made a mistake in the beginning of our model and had only children and student ministry sort of milestones. And I had an aha moment about 2 years into it to say, wait a second, really everything we're doing here is adult discipleship, teaching them actually to disciple the next generation in the context of their home. So I think that the church in the future has to see this not as family ministry, not as some appendage, but as a part of the way that we make disciples of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Ross, same question. Where do you see the future of family ministry?
I think for the past 50 or 60 years, in lots of cases, the pastors, leaders of the church are meeting weekly, and they're trying to hopefully ask God and dream up, what are we going to do? What are we going to promote? What programs are we going to lead? And as soon as you get your plan in place, then the next question is, how do we get our people to support our plan? And often that would be, how do we get the families of the church to support our plan? So the church and its programs were the central issue. Seeing families as what will make our program successful is the second question. I slowly now think that is going to change, and I think more and more the pastors are going to sit around saying, what can we do to make our family successful in discipling the next generation? So the shift would be toward the family being a unit, not only for transformation, which is absolutely the beginning point, but even beyond transformation, to see the family as a way we're going to win the world to Christ, locally as well as globally. And I think that will energize churches to believe more transformation in the home makes sense, because now we're so excited. We're watching people meet Jesus through the influence of our families. We're watching families put lost people in their cars and bring them to church. We're seeing families get in the car as a family and go serve people in great need. I think that's going to be the future. And I think beautiful, deep, wonderful, rich discipleship in the home is going to be what will fuel that. Transformation of the hearts of the people that live there is going to turn into, how do we join Christ in changing the world?
I can remember a long time ago when I was in school having a seminary professor, Howard Hendricks, do you remember that name? And how he, saying, hey, the greatest tool we have for evangelism is a distinctively loving Christian home, And, but for so often, I think, and so long, it was like, you'd put that, even when I was on the elder board at the church and on staff, that was one of your key, that was made the top 10. But then when you ask, what were you really doing? It wasn't being done. But, and I think part of the reason why, and this is to me what's happening right now, is there's a movie that I love to watch. There's a few movies, I watch every year, like Hoosiers just before the NCAA tournament, and Groundhog Day. I always watch that movie. But has anybody ever seen the movie Oliver? It's it's a musical, and it's these little street urchins that are in like an orphanage. And there's one scene where one boy is new orphan, he's eating his gruel, and he goes up to the headmaster. Now they're in this big auditorium like we're in now, where all the tables are, over on the side. So they're eating a bowl of gruel, which isn't good. Whatever gruel is, it's not good, right? And then, but over here, they're having this sumptuous meal, all the, totally different than the kids, big, chickens and all these different kinds of things. And so he walks over and asks for a little more. Do you remember that? And then they all start singing, Oliver, Oliver, never before has a, boy asks for more, and they're all dancing on the tables. Well, what happens is the camera pulls back. Now, the version I'm talking about is the 1953 black and white Oliver. It's the best one. There's been other ones, but that's the best one. And so here's these kids dancing on the table, and all of a sudden the camera shot pulls back, and guess what's on the back wall? Huge letters. It says, God is love. Well, that's propositional truth. That is absolutely true. God is absolutely love. But they were not experiencing it every day and having to ask for it. And so I think that the shift has been from such an educational model, and we're all educators. We certainly love, I work at a seminary and we love Christian education, and but moving from proposition, just the proclamation, to really kind of like you guys are just saying, it's the whole family getting engaged. That's what led me to Christ. I think for a lot of us, it was when I'd go to the home of this young life leader and I watched his family love Jesus and, saw a 6'4" version of Jesus, the guy that led me to Christ. So I think that's the part that I'm so excited about the church catching fire on is, again, equipping the home to be the ones that go out and does that.
Well, as a matter of follow-up, let's talk more about the future, because I loved your teaching when you would teach about the youth of our nation being the ones God chose to lead the revivals historically, right? Well, I think in the family ministry movement, God's used age-graded ministers, children's ministers, youth ministers, preschool ministers to do something very, very special. But in the midst of that, when I think about the future, I hear a groaning in the spirits of these ministers that are saying, we need senior pastors to join the party. We need their influence for it to advance. So you've kind of written a book on that, so I'm going to start with you, Dr. Ross. How can we help in the future invite senior pastors to the party?
I think a major piece of that puzzle is very similar to comments these guys have just made. If you are seeing family ministry as another box, it's just another thing that we do. A senior pastor who's already stretched to the limit is saying, okay, everybody depends on me to bless their thing. That's the only way anything will succeed. So now you're just telling me here's this other thing that I need to get behind. I think you could respond with a yawn, if that's all that he sees this as. To me, the key is for him to perceive there is a mission, there is a ministry for our church, and as lead pastor, I'm really supposed to embody that, and I'm supposed to champion and lead us toward that. What he's got to figure out is this isn't another program to the side. This is the way I accomplish the ministry of the church. This is the way I mobilize my people on mission, especially if you embrace the fact that many of us live as family many, many different ways. If you are comprehensive in saying every arrangement in our church is family, and for some it is the church family that is the family. If you allow for that, then you're seeing the total church in families mobilized to help the church perform what it's to perform. Therefore, the pastor's not taking on something new, he's simply doing what is central to his calling. And I think the pastors that have been at D6 and who do get drenched with that perspective have gone home to champion churches in that direction. We just need that virus to spread much more widely.
Yeah, it's funny because I look at it from two perspectives. One, I've been the senior pastor leading the workshop where all the children and family people show up, or student people show up, and they are frustrated and exasperated after 2 or 3 years of trying to make it the best that it could possibly be. They sort of hit a lid with the senior leadership in the church, and they always ask, how do we influence? But I think your question is really great beyond just the question of how do they influence sort of up the ladder. Why would these guys listen anyway is a great question. And if they see this as a children's ministry movement, it's for somebody else. It's to be delegated. And I, as a senior pastor, I receive all kinds of invitations to lots of programming and curriculum and people and all these things. If I responded to every opportunity, from every leadership organization, discipleship organization, and tried to do what they're telling me to do, I would be insane, right? And it can feel like just one more email, if that makes sense. So they need to be shoulder tapped to vision. They need to understand, I think, two things really clearly. Every family in the congregation at some point or another is going to be desperately in need of Jesus and really open to discipleship. So, because we all know family's not perfect, families are going to hurt. There's going to be wounding. There's going to be, I need help with my kids. I need help with my marriage. All of that reactive stuff. Most senior pastors get that that's happening and feel exasperated about it. How do I help with all that? But if they can begin to see, like, we've got to take those same units that we're seeing all this brokenness in and really empower them, react to that, and help them work through it, but then empower them to do two things. One is to walk with Jesus in the context of their own home, because that's the place where faith is really refined. I can fake you out at church every Sunday, but at home, everybody really understands who's who and who Jesus is to us. So really helping them demonstrate the gospel at home, which doesn't mean perfection, it just means authenticity. And then also helping those families make disciples of other families. When the senior pastor attaches this to his vision for making disciples, it changes everything. So it's not a system like groups. It's not a program like a retreat but it's an overarching philosophy that drives vision. And when a senior pastor can attach to it that way, he can lead his elder board to it, he can lead his whole staff to it, he can lead his whole church to it, because God's behind family when it comes to making disciples. So.
I'll throw out one thought that just ties in with what they both shared. When I was growing up, I grew up in a single-parent home. We didn't know Christ, first-generation Christian. We were the only kids. Now, this just shows you just in one generation, okay? Kachina Elementary School was our elementary school, and our football team were the Kachina Dolls. We struck fair in the heart of all the other teams, of course, going to play them. But my older brother, my twin brother, and I were the only kids from a single-parent home in our grade school. Not our class, in our entire grade school. There was one other girl whose dad had died in Iraq, but not through divorce. So we were the only single-parent kids from divorce. My wife is a first, second grade teacher right now. She has 22 kids. 18 of those 22 kids are from either single-parent or blended families. And what goes to school comes to church. And what I'm getting at is there's that brokenness that used to be, just kind of like you were saying, I think part of why, in the senior pastor level, it was like, well, wait, but anybody on church staff, you didn't want to admit there was any problems with your family. Let's put the family thing over here. I'm going to just preach the word of God, which is hugely important again, but let's not really deal. But now, guess who goes to seminary? There's lots of brokenness and hurt, but with that comes that authenticity, just like you mentioned, to say, okay, where can we step into people's lives, even in the midst of that? And so I'm excited. I mean, that's one of the things I'm thrilled about, is that there's a willingness to not just delegate it, but just to say, well, it's messy, it's tough, there's brokenness, there's hurt, but it also is just such an incredible opportunity to step right into the place where they're, a week ago, they may not have cared at all about a high school kid that's off the rails. This week it may be the only thing they're thinking about, So again, we get to use family ministry as that great tool, I think, to just admit, man, we need a Savior. And how exciting is that?
Jeremy, I want to lean in a little further to your question, because you kind of reminded me that 2009 and 2010, there was one conversation I had with ministry leaders in the aisle that absolutely broke my heart, and I want to get your reaction to this. 2009 and 2010, we had exactly what you were discussing, Brian. We had children's ministry leaders. Overwhelmingly, children's ministry leaders were the number one attenders to the D6 conference in the first 2 years, followed by youth ministers or student ministers. Those were the two bigger areas, because when we think family ministry, that's where people tend to gravitate to. And I remember having student pastor and several children's pastors. I remember one lady who was a children's ministry leader. She was standing in the aisle, she was talking to me, and she says, Ron, We've got our entire team here. And she had tears just running down her cheeks. She said, but we can't get our lead pastor here. She says, how do we do that? And I began to study that. And here's what I came up with. The results were very, very obvious. The reason why lead pastors are not leaning into the conversation is most of them have kids that are teenagers or they're empty nesters, and one or more of their kids have walked away from church, are not serving God, and they feel hypocritical or without integrity if they lean into that conversation. And so we began to tackle that. And you used the term a while ago, Brian, so I'm going to start with you, a shoulder tap, and said, we're going to tap that pastor on the shoulder and say, here's how you would deal with somebody in your congregation who was facing a challenge. We need you to deal with it the same way and step back into the equation. Will you expand on that? Because there are a lot of pastors wrestling with, how can I be part of family ministry when the whole congregation knows I have a child who's really struggling there?
Well, transparently, I certainly know what it means to be writing books and talking about family, and at the same time going through a season with a teenager where, man, it is tough and difficult. And, Angela and I had many nights in the fetal position, like, what in the world? We had all the God moments. We did the faith talks, and so I get that from the leader perspective. There's a tendency, I think, for us to put forward a false front, and I'm just totally opposed to that. I have tried to model my own ministry and congregation like, if I'm hurting, I'm hurting. And if I need counseling, I need counseling. And if my kid needs counseling, my kid needs counseling. And so in the context of our church, I would think that if you pulled anybody from our church, one of the things they would say is, like, our pastor's really transparent, not to the point of throwing his family under the bus, but really transparent, like, I'm living a real life here. And so I think senior pastors, and I get the hurt, but I think we have to get over ourselves, because we're not Christian robots that we're just as in need of a savior, just as in need of a rescuer, just as in need of grace, all that. So I think we should talk about it for one thing. I think it takes some humility for the senior pastor to say, maybe I don't feel like I have some regrets, or I feel like I didn't do this exactly right, but I want to help other people have a different experience. And I think that's a leap we have to make. I think how to make that leap actually comes in having senior pastors behind closed doors, away from children's pastors and student pastors. And I think it's let's all get in the room together and let's be real, and then let's talk about how we help our churches. So they're probably not going to show up in mass for what they deem a family conference, but they will show up for clusters of groups with mentors that say, like, help me work through my stuff, and then let's help the church work through its stuff.
I think the beginning point is exactly what you and Brian have been saying in terms of the inner healing insight into his own family. That is the beginning point. When you move from that to look out, then I think you gently but also very, very clearly allow pastors to articulate their vision, their direction, what they believe they have been called to do and to be, to move the... we would assume everybody can articulate that easily and it's on their hard drive. I'm not sure that is always the case. So just giving him an opportunity to think through that prayerfully, scripturally, and then connect the dots. Say, okay, what some pastors are discovering is that to move here, one of the most effective ways to do that is to mobilize families. But you do that from the context of his own direction, his own calling. And then he says, I never really thought about moving my people that way before. That makes sense to me. So to me, rather than saying, we've got this prepackaged thing we'd love for you to buy into, I think you speak entirely from his perspective.
Good.
So guys, this has been a treasure, a genuine treasure, hopefully not just for Ron and I, but for all those that are listening. I don't think we're going to be able to wrap this in one episode, so if it's okay, could y'all come back next week?
Yeah,
All right.
great.
We'll come back. We'll do this again next week. Hey, for those of you that are listening, thank you, and we'll see you next week. We'll continue this conversation. Hope you have a great week of ministry.
You've been listening to the D6 Podcast. You can learn more about D6 at d6family.com. And if you're a minister, we invite you to join the D6 Leader Network by going to d6leader.net.